Welcome to Restoria, your cozy corner for gentle bedtime stories. My name is James and I'll be your host tonight. Every night, we bring you peaceful tales designed to calm your mind and help you drift off into a deep, restful sleep. So snuggle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. The story tonight is called The Keeper and the Stars. Chapter 1. The Keeper on the Cliff. On the farthest edge of Windmere Point, where the sea breathed its slow, ancient rhythm against the rocks, there stood a lighthouse, tall and white and gently weathered by salt and time. It had once been the steadfast eye of the coast, guiding fishing boats and cargo ships safely through fog and midnight storms. But those days had passed. Now the ships had blinking screens and soft-spoken voices in their cabins, whispering routes and warnings more precisely than any human hand could. The lighthouse lamp hadn't been needed in years at least, not for ships. Yet every evening, just before twilight spilled its honeyed light over the ocean, Eliot climbed the winding steps of Windmere Lighthouse. His knees creaked and his back protested, but his hands were sure, and his heart, though aged, still beat steadily with purpose. Eliot was the last keeper of Windmere Point. His hair was white as sea foam, his beard curled like driftwood vines, and his boots always smelled faintly of chamomile and salt. He wore a thick sweater year-round, patched in places with love and wool, and he spoke softly, mostly to the lighthouse, the wind, or the sea. Each evening, Eliot polished the lens until it shone like a quiet promise. He checked the lamp's mechanism, winding it by hand, though the electric system hadn't needed winding in decades. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he lit the lamp, and the light glowed, not just across the waves, but upward, casting a warm, golden beam into the sky, piercing the gathering dusk with a softness that couldn't be measured in lumens. It shimmered like a lullaby, gentle and constant, pulsing with something that wasn't quite magic, but wasn't quite ordinary either. Because Windmere Lighthouse held a secret. Eliot had discovered it years ago, not through instruction or design, but by listening. Some nights, when the world was especially quiet and the sea seemed to sigh in its sleep, Eliot would sit in his rocking chair beside the great lamp and talk. Not to anyone in particular. Not at first. He would tell stories, memories of his youth, tales of imaginary sea creatures with ribboned fins and glowing eyes, or simple thoughts about the day. He didn't expect anyone to hear them. But something curious happened. The light, which had always shone steadily, began to flicker gently in rhythm with his words. And then, over time, Eliot noticed that on the nights when clouds covered the stars and the wind howled through the cliffs, the lamp glowed brighter, not urgent or frantic, just present. Comforting. It was then Eliot understood. The lighthouse wasn't only a guide for ships. It had become something else. A beacon for dreams, for thoughts adrift and souls unsettled. When the stars disappeared, the lighthouse filled the sky in their place, not with brightness, but with kindness. That night, like all others, Eliot made his way to the top, tea in hand, wrapped in his heavy sweater. Outside, the sky was the soft gray of approaching sleep, and the sea stretched dark and patient toward the horizon. He lit the lamp, and the beam rose. Tonight, there were clouds, thick ones, the kind that swallowed starlight and weighed on the world like an unspoken worry. Eliot felt it too, heaviness in the air, as if someone, somewhere, needed just a little extra light. He took his seat in the rocking chair, the one carved with seashells and polished smooth by time. He sipped his tea chamomile, always, and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he began to speak. Once, a long time ago, there was a sea turtle named Thistle. who had dreams too big for her shell. His voice was low and slow, woven with the hush of waves and the rhythm of tide. As he spoke, the lamp pulsed gently, its glow warm and wide, reaching far beyond the cliffs and into the high places where dreams go walking. He didn't know who needed to hear it. A child, perhaps, afraid of the dark, or a traveler on a night bus, their heart heavy with homesickness. Maybe someone who hadn't dreamed in a long time, but who had looked up tonight hoping to remember how. Eliot told the story of Thistle and the ocean stars, about finding your way even when the sky forgets to shine. His voice flowed like the tide, and the lamp's light moved with it, steady and sure. When he finished, he sat in silence, listening. Not for a reply, but for the quiet shift in the air that always followed. The way the sea seemed to breathe easier. The way the clouds, sometimes, would part just a little. He smiled. His work was quiet, but never unnoticed. Below, the sea murmured its approval. Above, the clouds softened, and behind them, stars stirred, preparing to shine again. And Eliot, keeper of Windmere Point, keeper of the stories and the light, leaned back in his chair, ready to rest. Tomorrow, he would climb the steps again. Chapter 2. The Lamp That Listens. The next morning came soft and slow, as all mornings did at Windmere Point. The sea whispered against the rocks in a hush-hush rhythm, and gulls wheeled lazily above the lighthouse. Eliot stirred in his cottage below the tower, his joints creaking in quiet protest as he rose from bed. He dressed without hurry, tugging on his sweater, warming his hands on a fresh cup of tea brewed with chamomile and mint. The lighthouse stood tall just outside his window, catching the morning light like it always had, but with the lamp now sleeping, its great eye turned inward. Eliot looked up at it fondly. "You worked well last night, old friend," he murmured. He didn't always remember his dreams, but this morning, he felt something gentle, lingering. Not a picture or a story, exactly more like the feeling of being cradled in light. He stepped outside to check the weather and found the clouds had cleared. The sea sparkled in that tentative early morning way, as if deciding whether to stretch out and shine or stay curled beneath the waves. After breakfast toast with sea salt butter and honey, Eliot walked the cliff's edge. He greeted the world as he passed. A nod to the gnarled cypress that leaned into the wind, a whistle to the crows that cawed good-naturedly from their perch. By midday, he had cleaned the lower gallery windows and tightened the railing bolts on the upper deck. Maintenance was never rushed here. It was simply part of the rhythm. Eliot didn't keep a clock. He kept time by the tide, the gulls, and the angle of the sun. Inside the tower, the spiral stairs waited, winding up and up like a seashell's secret. He climbed them slowly, pressing his hand to the wall where it had grown smooth from years of touch. The lamp stood quiet at the top, its lens clean and clear. Eliot brushed his fingers along the glass. "I don't know who heard the story last night," he said aloud, "but I think they needed it." He set about polishing the brass fittings, his rag moving in slow, practiced circles. The room smelled of metal, salt, and faintly of lavender left over from the oil he sometimes dabbed near the frame. By late afternoon, the clouds returned, not thick, not heavy, but just enough to veil the sun and soften the edges of the world. Eliot welcomed them. They made the lamp's job more meaningful. He brewed his evening tea in the small kettle at the top of the tower. Tonight, he added a sliver of lemon peel. The scent filled the air, curling into corners. As dusk crept in, Eliot lit the lamp. The mechanism whirred softly, and the golden beam stirred, stretching across the sea and into the sky like a thread of light stitching earth to stars. Eliot settled into his rocking chair. "Tonight," he said to the lamp, "I'll tell you about the boy who bottled wind." And so he began, his voice low and kind. The story unfolded gently about a child with a blue kite and a heart full of questions, who captured gusts in jars and gave them names: whistle, roar, sigh. The boy wanted to understand the world by holding its winds. The lamp pulsed with each sentence. Outside, the wind caught the edge of the sea and lifted it just slightly, like a mother smoothing a blanket. Somewhere far off, perhaps across the sea or in a quiet bedroom beneath a heavy blanket, someone breathed more easily. When the tale ended, Eliot closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. The lighthouse made no sound beyond the gentle tick of its old heart turning, but Eliot could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, the faint pull of dreams finding their course. The lamp had listened. It always did. As the night deepened and stars winked shyly through the veil of clouds, the light from Windmere held steady. Not bright, not demanding, just enough. Eliot took one last sip of tea, now cool, and murmured, "Rest easy, whoever you are." And somewhere out there, a child dreaming of flying jars, or a traveler missing the sound of home, slept more soundly than they had in days. Eliot leaned back. The lighthouse, like him, knew that sometimes the smallest lights reached the farthest, and the lamp that listened would shine again tomorrow. Chapter 3. The Letter in the Wind. A storm passed through Windmere Point during the night, the kind that rolls in quietly and lingers like a restless thought. It hadn't been violent just long. Rain had tapped the windows of Eliot's cottage until well past midnight, and the sea had swelled with a slow, deliberate anger before calming again by dawn. Eliot rose earlier than usual. The air outside still smelled of wet stone and salt, but the sky was clearing, streaked with sleepy pinks and worn-out grays. He stepped out with his mug of tea and took in the aftermath, the lighthouse standing proud and still. The sea no longer stirred, but sighing. That's when he noticed the envelope. It was resting on the first stone of the winding path that led to the lighthouse, just sitting there, perfectly dry despite the storm, as if it had waited for the world to be quiet again. Eliot bent down, knees cracking, and picked it up. It was cream-colored, thick with texture, sealed with a wax stamp of a star. There was no name, no address, just a note inside, written in a soft, looping hand. "Dear Lighthouse, thank you for the light last night. I didn't know where else to turn. I don't know if you're real or if you only live in dreams, but I saw you. You kept the dark from swallowing me. Please keep shining. A drifter." Eliot stood very still. He read the note again, slower this time, letting the words settle into his bones like warmth after a chill. He looked up at the lighthouse. "So they see you," he whispered. "They really do." That evening, Eliot climbed the steps with something new in his hands. The letter, folded and gently tucked into his pocket. The sky was clearer tonight. A few stars blinked through the fading blue, and the sea was calm, too calm for the lighthouse to be needed by ships. But Eliot knew better now. He lit the lamp. The glow swept out once more, stretching upward with quiet purpose, brushing the stars with soft gold. Eliot sat in his rocking chair, letter in hand. He unfolded it again, as if the words might speak differently this time, but they remained the same, honest, small, important. He placed the letter beside the lamp, careful not to let it catch the breeze. "Tonight," he said to the room, "I'll tell the story of the wind thief." And he did. It was a story about a boy who stole wind from mountaintops and tucked it into his sleeves, not to keep, but to give away, to people who had forgotten how to breathe easy, to towns that had lost their music, to dreamers who needed a gentle push forward. The lamp pulsed with the telling. Outside, clouds drifted across the stars, not thick enough to hide them, just enough to make them seem shy, and still the lighthouse glowed. Somewhere, Eliot knew, someone needed this story. Maybe it was the same drifter. Maybe it was someone else. But the light was out there now, curling over rooftops and through windows, slipping under blankets and into closed eyes. When the story ended, Eliot sat with the silence. It wasn't empty. It never was. Then, a breeze moved through the lantern room. Not strong, but certain. It lifted the letter ever so slightly, as if someone had touched it from afar. Eliot smiled. "You're welcome," he said softly. And the light continued to shine. Chapter 4. The Night Without Stars. Windmere Point had its quiet rituals waves folding onto shore, birds sweeping low at dusk, and Eliot lighting the lamp each night with the care of someone tending a flame in his own chest. But this evening, as the sky dimmed and clouds gathered thick as wool, something was different. There were no stars. Not a single glimmer in the sky. The darkness above felt heavy, as if the night had swallowed its own light. Eliot stood at the lighthouse window, looking out across the sea. The horizon had vanished. Even the whitecaps had turned a deeper black. He didn't feel afraid, not quite, but he felt needed, more than usual. He brewed a stronger tea, steeped longer than normal, and added a drop of honey. Tonight, he thought, the stories would have to be softer, warmer, the kind that folded around you like a blanket. He climbed the stairs slowly, each footstep accompanied by the creak of old wood and the hush of the wind curling around the tower. When he reached the top, the lantern room was already steeped in shadow. He lit the lamp, and the light rose not sharp or sudden, but steady. It unfurled into the sky like a golden sigh, cutting through the thickness above with patient resolve. Eliot watched it reach and reach until it vanished into the clouds. He sat. He listened. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass. And then he spoke. "Tonight," Eliot said, "is for those who can't find their stars." He began a story about a moth who lived beneath the earth, longing for the moon. Every night, it would burrow closer to the surface, guided not by sight, but by feeling the memory of light. When it finally emerged, it was greeted not by moonlight, but by the glow of fireflies, blinking their quiet companionship in the dark. Eliot's voice was steady, the story unfolding in the golden lamplight. As he spoke, the lamp brightened, not harshly, but with warmth, like the glow of a fireplace in a cold room. It wasn't just shining now, it was embracing. And in houses across towns and cities, in small bedrooms and quiet corners of the world, people stirred. Children breathed more softly. Grown-ups with heavy hearts felt something lighten, just a little. The kind of light you don't notice until you realize you'd been in the dark. The sky didn't clear. No stars appeared. But Eliot didn't stop. He told of the fireflies that guided the moth, and of the trees that leaned together to shield it from the wind. Of how sometimes the light we find isn't what we searched for, but what we need. He ended the story with a whisper. Even in the darkest sky, something is always shining sometimes inside us, sometimes in the quiet places we least expect. And he let the silence settle. He sipped his tea, now cool. The lighthouse glowed. There were no stars that night, but there was light. Enough to hold the darkness at bay, enough to help someone, somewhere, sleep. And for Eliot, that was enough. Chapter 5. A Visitor on the Wind. The following morning arrived in golden hushes. The storm had passed, and Windmere Point breathed a contented sigh. The sky, washed clean by rain, gleamed blue and bright, while the sea sparkled like laughter Eliot rose slowly, his bones heavy from the weight of the night before, but his spirit was lightened. There had been no stars, yet the lamp had shone. He believed, deep in his chest, that someone out there had felt it. He brewed his tea and stepped outside. The gulls wheeled in lazy spirals overhead, and the cliffs were slick with dew. As he stood in the morning stillness, he saw something unusual, a figure on the path. It wasn't often Eliot had visitors. Windmere was not a place you passed through, it was a place you sought. The figure approached slowly. A young woman, bundled in a long coat, her dark hair pulled back, her hands clutching something close to her chest. She looked up when she reached him, and Eliot saw that her eyes were tired, but kind. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely above the breeze. "Good morning," Eliot returned. "You came a long way." She nodded. "I wasn't sure I would find this place. I only had a feeling." Eliot smiled. "That's usually enough." The woman looked up at the lighthouse, her gaze softening. "Is it true that the light reaches farther than the sea?" "It reaches where it needs to," Eliot said. "Especially when the stars forget to show up." She held out what she'd been carrying, a small, crumpled envelope. "I wrote this a while ago. I didn't know who would read it." Eliot took it gently, recognizing the looping handwriting. The letter from the stone path. "You're the drifter." She nodded. "I never expected a reply, but I saw the light. I felt it." Eliot gestured toward the lighthouse. "Would you like to see it?" The woman hesitated, then followed him. They walked together in silence, the sound of their steps mixing with the rustle of wind in distant waves. Inside, the spiral staircase rose before them like a ribbon. Eliot climbed slowly, careful with each step. The woman kept pace, her hand brushing the wall occasionally, as if grounding herself. When they reached the top, the lantern room bathed them in quiet light. The lamp stood ready, even in daylight, a patient sentinel. She walked to the window and looked out over the sea. "I was in a hotel room," she said quietly. "Far from home, couldn't sleep. I didn't think anyone could hear me. But the lighthouse did," Eliot said. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Your story, the one about the boy and the wind, it felt like it was meant for me." Eliot didn't reply right away. Instead, he stepped over to the rocking chair and lowered himself into it, slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "we tell stories not knowing who they're for, but the lamp knows. It listens. It sends them where they're needed." The woman sat on the bench beside the window. "Can I leave something here?" Eliot nodded. From her coat pocket, she pulled out a small glass jar. Inside was a folded paper star. "It's a wish," she said, "from a long time ago. I don't need it anymore, but maybe someone else will." Eliot took the jar and placed it gently beside the lamp, next to the original letter. "It'll wait," he said, "until someone needs it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sea. Eventually, the woman stood. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping the light." "It's what I do," Eliot said, smiling. "But I think the light keeps me too." She nodded once, then turned and descended the stairs. Eliot remained in the lantern room, the jar and the letter beside him, the lamp quiet but alert. That night, he lit the light as always. But this time, he began his story with a new line. There once was a girl who gave away her wish so someone else might find theirs, and the lamp glowed brighter than it had in weeks. Chapter 6. The Star in the Lantern. The days at Windmere Point moved gently forward. The sea continued its slow dance against the rocks, and the skies brought their shifting moods, sometimes glowing with sun, other times cloaked in clouds, but always surrounding the lighthouse in its quiet rhythm. Eliot, too, moved in rhythm. He climbed the stairs each evening, tea in hand, story in mind. The lamp glowed on, casting its golden thread skyward. But something within him had changed since the visitor, since the girl who called herself the Drifter left behind her wish in a jar. It now sat nestled beside the lamp, beside her letter, a quiet reminder that the light was not just seen, it was felt. One evening, just as dusk melted into indigo, Eliot arrived in the lantern room with a small bundle cradled in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing an old telescope piece, brass worn and lens dusty. He hadn't used it in years, but tonight the air was so clear, so open, it felt like the stars were waiting to be named again. He polished the glass and lifted it to the sky. Through the lens, constellations bloomed. Orion, with his belt neatly in line, Cassiopeia's gentle curve, the seven sisters clustered in glittering hush. And there, just beyond the edge of the lens, a new light. He adjusted the telescope. The light remained. Not a star, not a planet. It pulsed softly, steadily, as if it were answering. Eliot lowered the scope slowly. The lamp beside him gave a gentle hum. He didn't need to understand it. He only needed to believe it. That night, he told the story of the lighthouse itself, of how it had stood long before Eliot arrived, of how it had once saved sailors from shipwrecks and whispered comfort to widows on stormy shores, of how, when the world moved on to satellites and signals, it found a new purpose one no map could chart. He spoke of the lamp that reached the stars, not to shine on them, but to remind them that someone on Earth still looked up with wonder. Outside, the clouds stayed clear. The sky remained open. The jar with the paper star glinted beside the lens. Eliot gently lifted it and unscrewed the lid. He unfolded the paper with careful hands. On it, in small handwriting, was a single line. "Let someone else find their light." He read it aloud, his voice catching just a little. Then he leaned forward and placed the paper inside the base of the lamp. The glow intensified, not brighter, but fuller. It filled the room with warmth, as if all the stories Eliot had ever told were breathing together. In the world beyond Windmere, people stirred. A child in a hospital bed turned toward the window and smiled. A traveler on a midnight train looked up and felt suddenly less alone. An old woman sitting beside a quiet radio whispered, "There you are." And Eliot, the keeper of the light, sat in his chair, watching the lamp glow. "I think," he said softly, "that you've become a star yourself." He leaned back, hands folded in his lap. The sea whispered its thanks. The sky blinked in return, and Windmere Lighthouse kept shining, sending stories skyward, one gentle night at a time.